I am tremendously honored to have these folks up here together. Some of them know one another very well. Some of them have come to know each other just in the last few minutes, at least in person, and some of them have a storied history beyond having met in person. So I just want to go down the list. Peter Lee, CEO of Covered California. Charles Bakke, the President and CEO of the California Association of Health Plans. James Hereford, the COO of Stanford, is it Regional Medical Center or Stanford
Healthcare.
Stanford Healthcare, thank you. And Sarah Radcliffe, President and CEO of the California Life Sciences Association. Thank you all for being here. Charles, I want to start with you. Just a real general softball question to start. What are the kinds of things that you are watching in healthcare policy or market, either data or trends or other points of reference that help you offer advice and counsel to your members?
Yeah, I mean, we're in sort of this post-ACA landscape here, where we spent so many years getting ready for the coverage expansion. The coverage expansion has happened, and not that that's in the rearview mirror, but I think there's two real funding issues in our healthcare system that bear watching from the big picture. Obviously, with 14 million enrollees in Medi-Cal now, and the rapid expansion into managed care, we have more, 1 in 3 Californians is getting Medi-Cal coverage, 80% of those are in managed care plans, and it's an underfunded program. And so that's a real concern, especially as we look into the future and we see federal support for states that have opted to take the ACA expansion starting to drop in the next couple of years. And so, I see a funding gap on the horizon, and I see a state budget that doesn't have a lot of room for funding Medi-Cal and not a lot of interest by the Department of Finance in dedicating general fund dollars. So it's a really big deal with that many Californians receiving their health care through that system. And it's a real worry in the next couple of years. On the commercial side, we're moving into, and Peter is shepherding a lot of this in the individual market. We've got to keep affordability of our products. Our health plans have more people buying their products than in recent memory now, but they're also folks who are of lower income. And so as we move forward, we've got to somehow find a way to keep the price points lower. And so I'm, of course, like everybody else, watching our work with providers to work collaboratively to try and come up with ways to lower healthcare costs, try and hold down premium increases across the state of California. There's a lot of really interesting things going on. But I'm watching what's happening with the federal exchange and keeping track of the risk mix there and what I'm hearing from some of our national plans. And it worries me because if California goes, we've been kind of immune to post-ACA high skyrocketing premiums. And if that starts to happen in California, there's obviously some will be working hard, including plans and Peter and others, to try and prevent that. It could really create a bad situation where we have premiums going up, low-income individuals who can't afford to buy coverage being priced out of the marketplace, and you end up with the classic risk pool that's sicker than it should be. And I think a ton of credit should be given to California for the work that we've done to get a healthier population into our exchange than the feds did. It's really incredible, but we have to maintain that. And we have to look at policies to ensure that we keep a balanced risk pool moving forward.
Yeah. Peter, obviously the Covered California model has won a lot of accolades, maybe not as many as it should, perhaps, actually, with its active purchaser model. And that was a big bet early that California took that other states largely did not take. But the health care premium cost trends have been relatively contained compared to other states. You're now talking about adding additional quality indicators and transparency measures, not just on health plans, but on providers as well to a degree. Is that going to help or hurt the market sustainability if, some provider networks maybe don't like what they see out of Covered California, or maybe some health plans don't like what they see out of data, which I'm sure they would sometimes argue with if they didn't like it?
Well, let me cover that a couple ways. First, to Charles's point is, So I think many people here in the room know that over the last few years, California has been, as a state, remarkably successful on a number of fronts. The expansion of Medicaid here has happened very effectively. The rollout and expansion of Covered California, and the subsidy program has happened well with dramatically moderated risk premiums for the last few years in the individual market, 4% 2 years running, because we had a good risk mix in. You look around the nation, and the reason other states have stumbled is they haven't, it's not just a matter of how they purchased, it's some of that. We've focused on creating a competitive marketplace for consumers and plans, and that's driven things. We've also made some tough policy decisions early on. We converted the entire individual market in California to one common risk pool. 35 states that didn't do that, plans didn't know what to price for, they priced badly, they've lost a lot of money, they need to catch up. But I think nationally, in the next 2 years, you're going to see them catching up with California, a common risk pool. And I think one of the things that Charles said, and then I'll come to your question about the quality issues, is structurally what the Affordable Care Act does is assures that low-income people are never priced out. Premiums can go up, and they are shielded from those price increases. Who is not shielded is unsubsidized middle class. And I think that what we see here in other states, if you see a state that has a 25% premium increase, remember that the 90% of the people in their marketplace don't get hit by that because they're protected by the federal subsidies. The people off the exchange will get hit by that, which is a huge problem. Mm-hmm. California's, though, built a good risk mix that in the near term addresses affordability. What we're doing with our contracts, with our health plans, is the long term of affordability is not about risk mix, it's about changing how we deliver healthcare in America. It's about not doing unnecessary care, it's focusing on value, and that's what we're pushing our plans on to do what I think everyone up here agrees that we need to move to a healthcare system that is about about value, not volume, to move to a healthcare system that engages consumers more effectively, that actually rewards better care, not just more care. And we're now a big enough player to, in alignment, but with pushing our plans to go in the right direction more rapidly. And that's going to be uncomfortable for some plans. It's going to be uncomfortable for some vendors. It's uncomfortable on some levels with some providers. But I think everyone that I've talked to says directionally it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. So, James, I know you've got a lot of experience in the Bay Area and other states, particularly in this on this question of taking risk, and whether it's a health plan or a provider group that takes risk. There are a lot of hospitals out there that talk. In fact, I'd argue every hospital talks to some degree about moving from volume to value. Some actually do it. Some actually do it well. What do you think are the key obstacles holding back hospitals in particular, but provider groups generally, from really jumping in with large capitated risk contracts and maybe going directly to employers? There are a lot of physician groups, foundations in California that do some of this, but in the hospital space, what separates the actors from the talkers?
Well, the question itself poses part of the problem for the answer, which is in the hospital space. If you simply start from in the hospital space to talk about the management of risk, you've already lost. Mm-hmm. Because you can't start with the most expensive component of the healthcare system and then talk about how you're going to manage the overall risk of the population. So, I think the point made around value is absolutely critical. In part, we have to redefine what value means. Right, within our organizations, within our systems. So, we'll see a lot of, as we saw in the mid-90s, a lot of movement to take on risk and then suddenly realize that taking on risk is a non-trivial problem that is also a longitudinal problem. You don't take on risk for a year or two. I see a lot of people talking about, wow, we converted to risk and we saved 5% year over year. So what? That's random movement. Mm-hmm. It's can you manage risk year over year and do more than simply, we improved our coding, so our risk looks better, our risk performance looks better. Can you really get to the fundamentals of care? The other aspect then for hospitals is we have to think more like systems. So what do we know? Well, the literature's clear, and my experience at Group Health, I got to live this out for 20 years. The literature is incredibly clear about what is the number one predictor of organizations that can manage risk. It's high-performing primary care. If you don't have high-performing primary care, it's awfully difficult to manage risk effectively. So as hospitals, we have to start to think more broadly. I think the other thing that, as healthcare organizations, what is absolutely clear is we're going to move, no matter what happens with the ACA, and I think there are going to be challenges as we go forward, both politically, actuarially, whether those get ironed out or not. There's going to be less money in the system, because I think Peter's point is, I'll make it a little more stark way. There's a reason why the middle class hasn't gotten a raise in 20 years, is it's all gone to healthcare, right? And we need to be able to think about how do we, as less money is going into the system, how do we manage value at all levels of the care processes? So whether that's at the tertiary level, people are still going to want transplants. But we need to be able to transplant patients much more efficiently. And if I look at the waste in healthcare generally, the same is true in any particular organization. There's certainly plenty of opportunity at Stanford to take waste out of the system, in large part to be able to think about those processes in a much more integrated, holistic way. We're doing that now with joints, really thinking about how do we manage the process from the point of the initial surgical consult all the way through up to the procedure. And we know there's good evidence around doing prehab as a mechanism for lowering the cost and lowering the incidence of having to do skilled nursing facility care post-procedure. And guess what? Patients are happier, and our cost for doing the procedure is less. But we need to be able to scale that up and develop that deep process knowledge much more effectively to manage value through the system. It's not a trick. It's hard work. That's why people have a hard time doing it.
Yeah.
So can I follow up on something James said, which I so love it with Stanford Health System, starting with high-performing primary care, but I totally agree with that. And we've gotten a good bit of press in the last month or two about our contract requirements and our health plans that our board's acting on tomorrow. And there's been huge attention to the potential that we might at some point require health plans to either exclude hospitals or say why they're included. But that is a tiny piece compared to we've got elements all over the contract that really put gas in the tank for better primary care. We're requiring every one of our plans to make sure every one of our enrollees knows their primary care doctor they have within 30 days. That's historic. That's whether you're in an HMO or a PPO. And nationally, to say you can't get a well-functioning healthcare system if you don't have a primary care provider. We then go on to saying, what are our health plans doing around patient-centered medical care? What are they doing around ACOs? What are they doing to help patients choose wisely? And so, James, I just want to celebrate what you're noting is that, often we look for the opportunities for tension and difference, but the issue of having a healthcare system is anchored in well-functioning primary care, which we as a nation have been really abysmal at. And we payers, whether I spend a little time at CMS or private payers, have generally piggybacked on very high payments to intensive specialty and not rewarding that advanced primary care. So I think that's when we think about some of the changes we all need to have, it's the right building block.
Sarah, the life science sector, the innovation and pharmaceutical sector, from where I sit, holds tremendous promise for change and is clearly a tremendous cost center in some risk-bearing and health plan populations. But it strikes me that it's just a culturally different part of the healthcare sector. And I want to ask a question about innovation and see if you have any observations from that side of the ledger, which is a smart fellow, Rick Rubin, who I know at least James knows, said in one of our videos that everywhere else you look, in every part of the economy, innovation typically means compressing the space between the consumer and the provider. And we remove middlemen. In healthcare, we institutionalize middle managers, and we call that innovation. And so we find covered California, which has been successful in keeping down costs. But we do that, and we celebrate that as innovation. And so his argument was, even though those things all make sense when they are done, collectively it is a tremendous burden for the system. Any observations from where you sit in this innovation space on maybe where the system could do better at compressing the space between purchaser, consumer, and provider?
That's a great question. So Absolutely, the system could do a lot better, but to return to what you said at the top of your question, it is clear that we are in a very different space from other kinds of innovative areas. I mean, everybody knows this is not an iPhone, this is not a handbag, this is not a car. One of the reasons why healthcare is so why the healthcare system is so complicated is that indeed healthcare is very complicated. It is not only something that is generates information that's difficult for the consumer to understand and come to grips with, it is also extremely important, right? So the kinds of medications that are now under scrutiny by the public are medications that truly are extraordinary. They are life-saving. And whenever you have something life-saving, I'm not the first person to say this, people think it ought to be free. And one understands that from an emotional perspective. So yes, it would. I think part of the answer to our to the dilemmas that we find ourselves in is to shrink that space between, if you like, the purchaser and the vendor. But it's never going to be like other parts of the system. It's never going to be like other innovation, and I think that's something you just have to recognize.
So let me pose this question to any of you and follow me down this rabbit hole for a minute. Our morning keynote speaker, Dr. Ari Bayak, had a slide quoting Confucius that says, wisdom begins by using the correct words, by naming things what they are. And it strikes me that the issue of increasing specialty pharma, both as an innovator, an innovative force and a cost center, really got traction around the name Sovaldi, right? When we had a miracle drug that cured Hep C, and that cost $82,000 for a 3-month dose. When we get into the space of institutions like Stanford or Oregon Health Sciences University and the Knight Cancer Fund, when we get into this space where providers or plans are able to purchase genome-specific drugs that are produced for just one or a very narrow group of 10 or 20 individuals that save their lives and improve the quality of life, but which could be priced at anything, you know, and as a consequence could be extraordinarily difficult to pay for, but which have no single name and fly under the radar screen. When we get to that place, which is just a few years away, is that a threat or is that a promise? What does that world look like when genome-specific drugs, when I have a provider like Stanford manufacture me a drug that saves my life, that applies to nobody else? What does that world look like?
So I actually think that's part of the incredible opportunity, but we have to reframe it differently because Sovaldi's route actually not a great example, right? It's a fundamental cure to a disease and a terrible disease, and it's a tremendous thing. But I think we have to reframe about, first we talk about precision medicine. So the treatments we use largely now, especially in complex disease, are a process of hit and miss. So often the treatments we use and the expenses associated with that, we're not sure if it's going to work or not, and it often does not. So I think that the opportunity, and it's not just genomics, it's all of the omics, is that we can become much more precise in treatment. But at Stanford, we want to extend that, right? So not just the treatment of disease, but how do we think about precision health? So how do we get in front of it? How do we look at early markers, right? Pre-disease stage markers to be able to understand that and then be able to intervene much earlier in the disease process before it really becomes an issue. We know all kinds of things that we're learning now about cancer in terms of some of the markers that present themselves well before cancer ever develops. Well, that's the promise, right? Because we're an incredibly capital-intensive industry, and unlike other industries, when we deploy a lot of capital, we don't displace labor. Every time we deploy more capital, we have to add labor. I think we'll see a world over the next 15 years, 10 to 15 years, where we start to look more traditional, where we start to shrink that space because our ability to be precise both in the treatment and in the diagnosis and much earlier in terms of thinking about health, not just treatment of disease and precision medicine, gives us an opportunity to change the nature of a lot of that very expensive capital we're deploying now. So it's much more leveraged in terms of its effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. Charles, what do you think about any of James's comments? I mean,
it's well thought out. It looks like a magical land, wonderful place to get to. We just have to be able to afford it as a country and as a society. Right now, the current trend is not good on the pharmaceutical side of the spend for plans and for our large purchasers and for state governments who are paying prices that are increasing for drugs that have been on the market for years, that really they've already paid off their R&D costs long ago. But yeah, there's no doubt that innovation is needed, and I think innovation should be rewarded. And I don't think we can have a country where innovation, whether it's hospitals innovating, health plans innovating, or pharmaceutical manufacturers or biotech companies innovating, should be punished. I think everyone deserves a right to be rewarded, or else you won't have innovation. I think when we get to this place 10 years from now, there's a lot of things that are going to happen between now and then. And we just have to make sure that these drugs are societally affordable, and ultimately someone has to pay. And whether it's in your premiums, or it's with co-pays, or it's the state government footing the bill for Medi-Cal enrollees who have no co-pays at all, it can be very expensive. But it sounds great, and obviously we have a manpower problem looming. Everyone talks about that in California when it comes to medical professionals, and to the extent that we can find ways to take the physical plant that James is talking about, which, the hospitals, they're machines. They hire a lot of people. They have a huge economic impact and footprint in their local communities, and that's expensive care. So if there's ways to keep people out of the hospital, certainly we're willing to look at them and willing to pay for them, but it's not a blank check.
Yeah.
First, I want to agree that Sovaldi's a bad example. And first, because Sovaldi, whether it started at 120, came down to 80, and now it's 50 or whatever, but it is an absolute cure. What's the right price? Hard to determine. And I wanted that when we look at cost, there's two elements. Covered California changed our benefit design, so even the most expensive specialty drugs wouldn't cost more than $250 a month in a copay. Okay, because we didn't want cost to be a barrier between people getting their drugs. But most of the drugs that are out there in the specialty drug world aren't your few years out, nirvana of a perfect drug that's a perfect cure. It's very expensive drugs that have marginal utility, that are on the margins of maybe a few months here, et cetera, and drugs prices being hiked up with a challenge of value. And I think that the bigger near-term issue that those of us that are trying to help consumers wade through this, figure out what to price is, in our contract, we ask our plans, what are you doing to assess the real efficacy of drugs you're putting on your shelf? Yeah. To understand, whether you're using quality adjusted life years, et cetera, do we as a society say it's 100,000, 200, 400, whatever, let's do it transparent. But a lot of the drug pricing out there isn't around that right now. We're seeing drugs that have been out in the market for 15 years going up fivefold and still being forced to use them. So I worry about the Sovaldi example. And I think that we need, across the market, better discipline on absolute effectiveness and what those costs are going to be.
And I just, to go back to the value-based discussion, there is some interesting talk about value-based with pharmaceuticals, and I go back in time, and I think if we had redid Sovaldi, if we could all go back in magic time machines and figure out how to make it work better, the promise was that the drug would cure you in, I don't know what it was, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. But, we found out in a lot of cases as plans that people needed twice as long. And at $84,000 or $78,000 or $58,000, when you pay for twice as long of the regimen to get the cure, well, then the promise of the value of the cure isn't what it was advertised. It was actually more expensive. And so it'll be interesting to see as plans work with pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies to come up with value-based pricing for drugs, whether or not, there's a way to price for that more reasonably. Yeah. If it takes twice as long or it takes twice as much, but the promise was the cure would be done in X amount of dollars, well, then who should bear the risk for that? And I think there should be some good discussion about that, and hopefully, we'll see some real fruit from the discussions between plans and pharmaceutical manufacturers.
Absolutely, and I think, The life sciences sector has got to be and is fully supportive of the idea that we have to have a system wherein price and cost reflect value. I wouldn't use the term magical land, but I would agree that's a whole lot more complicated than people think. And one of the reasons is we look at what it is to price by value. There are many things that should go into that that people are unwilling to put into that. So it's really not just cost versus that drug. It's that drug in the universe of drugs. It's that drug against many other types of interventions. It's what that drug could do over a much longer time horizon than governments are willing to look, and even the private payers are able to look. So we want to be fully supportive of a system where the products that the sector is producing are truly meaningful products. But defining meaning is, it's something that there are many different dimensions to it. Another piece of the puzzle, as we all know, is that incremental innovation, while it may be very expensive if you look at a narrow snapshot of time, as that incremental innovation builds up over time, as with the HIV drugs, you end up in a situation where you saved billions of dollars. So we can't stop that kind of innovation at the gate. Again, we understand nobody wants to be paying a vast amount for a small improvement. But how do you deal with the situation that those small improvements may be the only way to get to the truly extraordinary breakthrough?
Since it's just you and me.
Can I make one quick comment about the magical land?
Sure.
I think in some ways, Stanford has gives me a unique point of view into this, possibly, in that we shouldn't underestimate. I mean, if you look at Stanford right now, the vast majority, not just in the School of Medicine, but in engineering, in computational sciences, in the biosciences, the vast majority of the research is in biomedicine. We are at the precipice of what we saw 20 years ago in information technology. Now, whether that ends up in a magical land or a land in which we're paying, 25% of GDP, I don't know. I don't think we can afford 25% of GDP. What I will guarantee you, though, is that over the next 10 to 15 years, we are going to see scientific advances that will be the equivalent of, remember when we had a PET Commodore in 1985, and now I have 100x computational capability in that. That is what we're going to see in the biomedical sciences. Because I can see the research right now happening at Stanford. How we translate that into our healthcare systems, though, that's going to be the challenge.
Mm-hmm. But with that comparison, I think that, and I look forward to a lot of the potentials, and this is where we've had some market failures because, my device like yours, on a price per what we get compared to that Commodore, the prices have actually gone down for computing power dramatically.
That's right.
And I think the promise of life sciences and biomedical is we're doing a lot of hit and miss treatments right now. And that's what you led off with, James, is how are we instead not doing 18 hit and misses to say this is the right person for this drug? And how do we marshal that value question to actually have this not be the wrong direction on the price curve, the cost curve for all of us, but actually bend it in the right direction?
It's an interesting argument, Charles and Peter, that on this point of value. I think a lot of plans talk rightfully so about value commonly. It's a well-worn semantic pathway, and providers get it. But value in this pharmaceutical space and innovation space is trickier, right? We're trying to figure out some risk-sharing contracting models between plans and maybe oncology drugs and some interesting things there. But it would be reasonable, if I were to make some in the pharmaceutical industry's argument for them, it'd be reasonable to say value should be taking the full benefit of this drug. And we'll charge you 0.5 of that, rather than what pharmaceuticals have been in history, which is we're going to find out the cost to bring something to market, and we're going to charge X on top of that, which is a cost-based methodology. But doesn't the notion of value say, well, look, here's all of the benefit you're going to get? Again, I'm making the argument for the industry, but how would you respond to that?
I mean, I've heard the argument, in panels like this multiple times, and I think the gentleman from Gilead does a great job of showing how they priced their drug, how all of this magical stuff goes into the thing and behind a curtain, and we take into account all these things, but not how much it costs, and not how much we spend on marketing, and not how much we spent to actually do R&D, and not how much this, and we didn't count that either. But the value of the drug is just wow. I mean, it's just so much, and you walk away from it going, I don't know what I just heard. So earlier we were talking about defining value. We were talking about defining what success is. And I think that right now we're in a system where one party is getting to define all of those terms and price it, and the rest of us have to eat it. And I think that's the problem. And there needs to be a debate about it. But I do think that it's not just about cost base. I mean, absolutely R&D costs are important, but when you're only spending $1 on R&D for every $19 on marketing, I mean, what are you paying for there? I mean, you deserve to recoup your marketing costs. I'm not saying you don't. Someone has to come up with a set of metrics that makes sense that we all agree on. And I feel like some of you, well, actually most of you in this room saw The Electric Company. My kids will never see The Electric Company, a TV show on Sesame Street, or after Sesame Street on PBS. They always had this bit where they had 3 or 4 people up on podiums doing things, right? And they played the song, one of these kids is doing their own thing. Can you tell me which one it is? And I feel like as we're talking with our provider partners, and look, as plans, it doesn't always go easy when we're talking about controlling costs with our provider groups. And when we talk to our purchasers, and they're telling us, you got to hone down on costs, I do feel like we're all kind of trying in our own ways to pull this idea of affordability and transforming our healthcare system. And I think biotech has this great space where they're kind of off doing really fantastic stuff. We just need to get them pulling together with the rest of us in a way to try and make things affordable. And I think that's possible. I think that if we work together, it's better than working against each other. And I can just say that if any other of the segments of the healthcare market went off on their own and kind of did their own thing, everyone's going to call them out on it. And I think that's happened for providers. It's happened for plans. And my hope is that we can work together to solve problems. We can do it without having a lot of interventionist policies. But we've got to get going especially on this cost driver. And hopefully we'll see some progress shortly.
Yeah, I would certainly agree that we have to work together. I think we are beginning to see that, though. You saw, Lilly and Anthem exploring some new models, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there are folks out there who are really trying to look at new models to address healthcare costs, and I think that's a very exciting development. I, of course, take issue with the idea that somehow the biotech sector, or the life sciences sector in particular, is off on its own, kind of doing its own thing. In a very complicated environment, we also see the plans adopting very new strategies for shifting costs to patients. And these are things that we're very concerned about. So again, I think everybody's seeking ways to address cost issues, and certainly for our sector, the watchword has got to be what, at the end of the day, serves the patient. I'm sure that you would ultimately agree, right? That's where we're all trying to get at.
So, Sarah, let me ask you a question, since it's just you and me and a glass of wine here.
Yeah.
It strikes me...
And 100 people.
It strikes me as that you have an extraordinarily tough job. You and folks at pharma, like Tara Ryan, who's here, and other folks who represent the industry of innovation or the industry of pharmaceuticals. In that, in my opinion, some biotech companies are not as engaged in the legislative process or public affairs process as perhaps they might be.
Yeah.
Yet, at the same time, on Super Bowl Sunday, I see commercials about opioid diarrhea or constipation and some other.
That was a great one.
You know, some not great representations of the promise of, you know, so you've got this sort of marketing team that's creating these commercials that appears to operate in a vacuum related to public affairs or regulatory affairs. And then you get to appear up on stage and talk about unicorns and you know, leprechauns in Magic Fairyland. Your job seems really hard. Is it?
No. Well, it is extraordinarily challenging. It's extraordinarily challenging because health is very challenging. I cannot imagine being anywhere else because of the kind of work that our members are doing. I am not one to bash health plans or insurance. I truly am not. It is an extraordinary advance. Without insurance, insurance across many different industries, we'd be in a very, very different situation. So we understand that the insurance industry has to be healthy. One of the things that is extraordinary about my job is that these companies are making the products that are changing people's lives. You know, so my favorite part of my job is I get to go to these companies, I get to talk to the scientists, I get to hear about the things that they're doing, and I'll tell you, that gets me up every single day of the year. So there's a sense in which it is challenging that, you know, we get up and we think, somehow we got to get products for cancer. Somehow we got to get products for diabetes. You know, that's motivating. But yes, we have seen some situations where companies have behaved in ways that we would not prefer. What I would say is that our companies that are members of the California Life Sciences Association are research-based. So what they are thinking about as they are addressing reimbursement issues is how do we follow up on the kind of potential that James talked about. There is just so much sitting there to be discovered, and to get the kind of reimbursement to take these products through an extraordinarily costly, lengthy, complicated, risky process to get to the patient. It takes a lot. And we have to figure out how to make that happen.
Let me interject or interrupt. I'm sorry, James. The stalwarts who are here have been drinking from a fire hose today, and in the few minutes that we have left, I want to just give each of you an opportunity to give them your advice. What should they be watching? What should they be thinking about as they go on and try to tackle this behemoth challenge? And I'll just go down the line here in about a minute, or, you know, quick sort of direction to the crowd. Peter, I'll let you start.
Wow. I would say beware watching Sunday television, because our presidential elections have become challenging to bear. And in seriousness on that, I mean, one of the big things for me and all of us is on some levels, this too shall pass, but we will have a new president and a new Congress in a year. And that's going to shift directions, but I actually don't think in very big ways. And I think California in particular, we're here in California, has set an example for a state that has tried to address the range of issues of coverage and care constructively. And I think the big thing for us is to, in many ways, stay the course. I'm really very optimistic under, believe it or not, virtually any electoral circumstance, having met with Republican members of Congress and Democrats, that when you get beyond the high-level politics, which is going to be fraught with over the next 6 months, we have work to do. And I'm optimistic about that. So that's my main thing that I'd say. Great.
Advice, Charles, to our audience?
No, I mean, I already had my chance kind of at the beginning, so I don't want to spend too much time, but I will just say that I agreed with Peter a lot, you know, for this entire campaign, except for like about a month ago, I started to really panic. You know, because it seems really nuts, but you're right, it's going to pass, and the Republic will go on, America will move forward, and you know, I think that repealing the law has so many downsides that it's hard to see how you politically pull that off and have a sustainable career, but so I'm trying to stay positive, Peter, but it's been trying.
You know, kidney stones also pass.
Yeah.
Painful as they may be.
James, advice to our audience?
Well, now I see why Peter sat in front of the flag. That was well done.
Thank you for that, James.
So I think, one piece of advice would be to be careful of what you almost saw play out here, which is if you've been doing this for any length of time, we tend to have the needle goes by the whipping boy. So for right now, let's, pick on pharma. Before that, it was those evil health plans. Before that, it was those terrible hospitals. I think the real hope of organizations like Peter, what they represent, is the opportunity to convene the system in a different way. And I think that's what I would be looking for. Be looking for those organizations who recognize that the answer to the prisoner's dilemma game is not retreat, right? Is not to simply throw somebody else under the bus, but to engage, right? That's going to be the difference. It's going to take all the components of the system to be able to come together and find better answers. It won't be by, trying to take one component of the system. It's like looking at your hand and saying, that's a bad hand and you've got to get your act together. You need to be able to think about the body as a whole to be able to improve your health. I think the same thing's true in the system. So I think that's what we need to be both looking for, and more often as organizations, we need to be acting in that way to come together and really search. These are hard questions. If these were easy, if it was easy, we'd have solved it a long time ago. These are hard, difficult, societal level questions, and we need to come together and have serious conversations, not the garbage that we hear out of the 30-second soundbite in either political advertisements or in debates, but the professionals coming together and really engaging about how do we solve this.
Sarah, I'll give you the last word.
So I would say an oft overlooked aspect of the discussions around finding a sort of a common understanding of value is antitrust. That is, I think there's an extraordinary will out there on the part of companies and on the part of insurers to really think proactively about how to ensure that patients who need care get that care. Antitrust, which is antitrust compliance is absolutely critical for the reasons that we all know, prevent companies and insurers from sitting down and making certain kinds of agreements in common. So people often bemoan the fact that these discussions aren't going on. Well, there's a very good reason for that. What is going on is these discussions between particular companies and particular insurers, and that's where I'd really look, I think, for some of the innovation and new models. You asked what I think people ought to be focusing on. I agree with much of what's being said. I don't know that I'm still extremely concerned about our elections, so who knows what will happen there. The one piece that I would add is to look at some of the regulatory innovation that is out there. When we think about our advocacy at CLSA, we think about what we call the 3 R's, fostering research, the regulatory environment, and reimbursement, and really looking at the regulatory barriers to production of some of these new great products is also a very important piece of the puzzle to get that cost of research down.
Great. Let's give them a round of applause. Sarah Radcliffe from CLSA, James Hereford from Stanford Healthcare, Charles Bakke from the California Association of Health Plans, and Peter Lee from Covered California. Thank you all. I think this is a demonstration of the kind of collaborative discussion that we have to be able to move our system forward.